I celebrated alone on my 90th birthday while my family was on vacation using my money. I turned 90 on a Thursday that began with the kind of dull, persistent rain that doesn't pour, doesn't thunder, but simply lingers. A quiet, cold drizzle that settles into your bones and makes the walls of your house feel just a little closer than they should. I had been awake since dawn, not because I was excited. No one past the age of 80 grows eager about birthdays, but because something in me, some stubborn, foolish part still clinging to hope like ivy on a crumbling fence, believed that this year might be different. That even though they hadn't called the night before, even though I had received no hints of plans or visits or surprises, someone might knock on the door. Someone might remember. I sat in the kitchen, wearing the navy cardigan I'd kept neatly folded at the back of my dresser, one of the few things I still cared to press and preserve. My husband, Charles, once told me it brought out the blue in my eyes, and though he had been dead for nearly a decade and a half, there were mornings, like this one, when I wore it in his memory, as if somehow dressing in a way he loved might anchor me to the parts of myself that hadn't yet faded. The cardigan was warm, but the tea wasn't. I had boiled the water twice, distracted the first time, forgotten it on the second. It sat there in the chipped white cup, going tepid in my hand, while I stared through the window at the sagging garden, at the roses that bloomed too early this year and were already rotting on the vine. There were no balloons, no cake, not even one of those tacky cards with glittery letters and a pre-written rhyme. What I had was a silence so heavy it felt like a second skin, the kind that clings to you, that makes the house feel larger and more hollow all at once. I checked my phone 3 times before 9 o'clock, not because I expected anything by then, but because habit is a powerful thing, especially in old age. There were no missed calls, no messages, just an automated reminder from the pharmacy about a prescription I no longer took, and a week-old forwarded email from Talia, my daughter-in-law, confirming that the family had successfully booked their flights to Bali, first class, no less. Bali. The words still felt foreign in my mouth, like something from a travel brochure for other people's lives. My son Marcus had mentioned the trip in passing, casually, as though they were going down the road to visit friends for the weekend. At the time, I hadn't realized they meant to go during my birthday week, hadn't understood that this long-dreamed-of family vacation had been planned with such exact precision, with such blatant disregard for the calendar date that marked my 90 years on this earth. But when I looked back, and I would do a lot of looking back in the days that followed, the signs had all been there. The evasive responses, the deflections whenever I asked about making plans, the way Talia always seemed to change the subject whenever I brought up the idea of a family lunch or a simple gathering. They had known. Of course they had. And the worst part wasn't even that they had left. It was that they had done it with my money. Not just some casual birthday check, not a loan I'd offered, not a gift, but with the savings I had entrusted to Marcus 5 years ago, when he insisted that I let him manage things, that modern banking was too complicated for someone my age, that he would keep everything in the family and ensure I never had to worry about a bill or a balance again. He had come to me with that concerned look adult children wear when they pretend they aren't trying to take something from you, but rather protect you from it. I had agreed, partly out of exhaustion, and partly because I still believed that trust, especially the trust between mother and son, was a sacred thing. I remember the day we transferred the account. He sat beside me at the credit union, smiling, nodding, telling the young man across the desk that it was just a simple update, that it would make things more streamlined for Mom. He made it sound so reasonable, so safe. The word Power of attorney didn't even come up until after the documents were signed. By then, I had told myself it was just a formality, but it wasn't. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things changed. I stopped receiving statements. The mailbox was no longer a place of information, but of quiet mystery. Marcus said there was no need to send me things that would just stress me out. He said he would let me know if anything important came up, but nothing ever did. At least, not to me. Meanwhile, their house expanded. Their cars grew sleeker. Talia's social media, which I checked now and then through the laptop they insisted on buying me, but never taught me how to properly use, was a catalogue of spa visits, boutique purchases, and beachside brunches. The girls switched to a private school with better college prep, and suddenly there were fees and uniforms and unexpected costs, all of which seemed to funnel through that same family fund. I had asked once, timidly, about getting a new washing machine when mine finally stopped spinning. It had groaned and clanked its way through its last load of sheets, and I had stood there for a long time, staring at it, willing it to try one more time. When I mentioned it to Talia, she gave me that tight, polite smile she always wore when she didn't want to say no outright. "We're on a bit of a budget right now," she had said, the irony of that sentence slicing through me like glass. I hadn't asked again. I boiled my clothes in a pot that week, just like I used to when I was a girl during the war. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. And sitting there on my birthday, with the rain tapping against the window and the house settling into its usual midday silence, I felt something unfamiliar begin to stir. It wasn't rage, not quite. And it wasn't heartbreak either, because my heart had already borne enough weight to resist breaking again. No, this was something quieter, deeper. A kind of awakening, maybe. A realization that I had been sleepwalking through my own decline, gently pushed into the background by the people I had once centered my entire world around. They hadn't forgotten me. That would have been easier. They had used me. And the worst part was how easily I had let them. I stood up slowly, my knees aching as they always did in the damp, and walked toward the living room, where the photo albums still sat untouched in the cabinet under the old television. I pulled out the one from Marcus's childhood, flipping through page after page of birthdays I had baked for, gifts I had wrapped with shaking hands late at night, times when we could barely afford to put gas in the car, but somehow always made sure he had something to open on his special day. I lingered on one photo, him at 10 years old, frosting smeared on his chin, smiling at the camera with that same dimple that had melted my heart from the first time I saw it. I closed the album and set it gently on my lap. Perhaps he had changed, or perhaps he had always been this way, and I had refused to see it. But I saw it now, and once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. You can only decide what to do with a truth that remains. And so, for the first time in many years, I decided I would begin paying attention. Not just noticing, documenting, not just enduring, planning, not just waiting for someone to remember I existed, but reminding them that I had always been here, watching, listening, and at last, preparing. Because something had shifted, and I would not let it pass unnoticed. The days that followed my birthday passed with a strange clarity, like the fog had finally lifted from my mind, and all the details I had once ignored or explained away began to snap into focus. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through my own life, content to let others steer the course. Until that moment, that quiet, humiliating birthday morning, pulled me back into my body with a sharpness that stung. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply began to look. Closely. intentionally. I began with the filing cabinet in the hallway closet. It was an old wooden thing, heavy and too deep for my tired arms to comfortably reach the back. But I managed. I pulled everything out: yellowed documents, insurance papers from when Charles was still alive, utility bills from decades past, expired IDs and handwritten letters tucked between envelopes, until I found the last copy of a bank statement in my name, dated nearly 4 years prior. It was a tidy document, showing a comfortable balance, the result of careful saving, Charles's modest pension, and years of going without for the sake of the children. I remembered the number, not because I was obsessed with money, but because it had taken us a lifetime to build. Every time I looked at that total, I felt a small, private pride. That was before Marcus convinced me to streamline everything, before the paper trail vanished and I was left to rely on vague reassurances and the occasional shrug. I sat on the floor of the hallway, the folder open in my lap, and tried to piece together where it had all gone. Not the specific transactions, those were long hidden from me, but the feeling of ownership, the sense that what I had was mine to use, to give, to protect. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a person with choices and become a problem to be managed, a task, a liability. And so I made a list. Not a dramatic one, not a frantic one, just a quiet inventory of things I needed to understand. How much money remained? Whose name was on the deed to the house? What had been done under my name? What documents still bore my signature? I didn't know how to get all these answers yet, but I had lived long enough to know that finding the right person to ask was often more important than knowing the answers right away. I waited 3 days before calling Marcus. Not out of fear, though perhaps there was some of that, but because I wanted to be calm. I wanted to sound small, ordinary, like an old woman with simple questions and a soft voice. I asked if he could help me log in to the bank website again, said I'd forgotten the password, that I just wanted to look through some old transactions to refresh my memory. There was a pause, then a laugh. Light, easy. "Oh, Mom, no need for all that. I've got everything handled. You don't need to worry about statements or balances. It's all under control." He always said that. Under control. As if I were a leaky pipe or a nervous pet. I didn't push. I just hummed and told him I was grateful, that I'd let him know if I needed anything. He said they were having a wonderful time in Bali. The girls had gone parasailing that morning, and Talia was finally getting some real rest. I told him that sounded lovely and wished them well. But when I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. He hadn't asked how my birthday went. Not once. Not even out of politeness. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked to the neighbour's house, a small blue bungalow at the corner where Mrs. Haskins, a retired school secretary, had lived for as long as I could remember. We weren't close, but we were polite, and she had always been kind to me, bringing the occasional newspaper or leftover cookies at Christmas. When I knocked on her door, she looked surprised, and perhaps a little worried, until I smiled and asked if I could borrow her son's help, the one who worked in computers, as she once described him. 2 days later, a lanky young man named Aaron sat at my kitchen table, guiding me through the setup of a new email, a fresh login to my bank's customer service portal, and a request to recover account access. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't seem to care about the why. He was quiet, respectful, efficient, everything I needed. When he left, I gave him a $20 bill and a tin of butter cookies I'd had in the pantry since December. I think he understood that it wasn't about the cookies. With his help, I learned how to track digital records, how to access archived statements, how to request official documents from the bank. I learned slowly, stubbornly, scribbling everything down in a spiral notebook I'd kept for grocery lists. In those pages, the lists began to shift. From bread and eggs to passwords and phone extensions and banking terminology I hadn't seen since I last filed taxes on my own. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Mrs. Haskins, not Aaron, not even my old friend Joyce, who called once a week to gossip and reminisce about things neither of us really remembered clearly. I kept it all in my chest, like a coal that needed time to burn hot enough to change something solid. Weeks passed. The family returned from Bali, tanned and tired, complaining about jet lag and the cost of imported snacks. Marcus didn't bring it up, and I didn't either. I let him think everything was the same. I smiled when they visited. I complimented the girls' new braids and asked about their tan lines. I played the part I had always played, the quiet, agreeable mother, content with the crumbs of attention dropped in my lap. But behind my calm eyes, the fire spread. One evening, when they had gone, I pulled out the manila envelope I'd started filling. Inside were printed screenshots, photocopies, handwritten notes. Evidence. Not of a crime, not yet, but of a pattern. Misuse. Manipulation. At best, negligence. At worst, exploitation. I wasn't foolish enough to think I could confront them with it, not without a plan. But I also wasn't foolish enough to think I could wait forever. My memory was still sharp, but my body, my time, those were running out. I could feel it in the way my knees ached when I stood too long, in the way the days blurred when I wasn't paying attention. There would come a moment when I would need to act, and when that moment came, I wouldn't ask. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking I was simply a bitter old woman who had misunderstood. Number. When the time came, I would have facts, I would have papers, I would have truth, and I would not be alone. I have always believed that people show you who they are when they think you're not watching. And in my family's case, they had become very comfortable assuming I had stopped paying attention altogether, that I was just a relic, a soft voice in the background, someone whose presence made them feel virtuous, but whose absence they would not notice for days, perhaps even weeks. But the truth was, I noticed everything. I always had. Even when I didn't act on it. Even when I told myself that love meant forgiving before understanding. The envelope I had started assembling grew heavier, week by week. At first it was just small things. Bank printouts showing expenses that didn't belong to me. Screenshots of social media posts where Talia flaunted designer purchases. Vacation photos where captions mentioned blessed family time, while I sat home scrubbing mold off the bathroom tiles. Then came the deeper layers, property records, legal documents that had quietly shifted ownership from me to Marcus's name under the guise of estate planning, and even a notification about a loan I had supposedly co-signed, though I remembered no such thing. I didn't understand all of it, not at first, but I could read tone, I could sense erasure, I could feel the places where my signature had been used like a ghost's, silent, invisible, but binding. The worst part wasn't the money, it was the erasure, the quiet replacement of me as the decision-maker in my own life. I had raised my children to believe in kindness, to listen before speaking, to work hard and earn what they received. But somewhere along the way, and this I pondered often, Marcus had decided that what I had was his by inheritance, long before death had even claimed me. And Talia, though never openly cruel, had always looked at me with a kind of bland tolerance, as if she were doing a civic duty by including me in their lives. They had made me small, and I had let them. One Tuesday afternoon, under the pretense of sorting old papers, I took a walk to the local library, the same one where I had once brought Marcus as a boy, where he had run his fingers along the spines of books and asked endless questions about how stories got printed. The irony of it struck me then, as I sat in one of the quiet back corners with a reference librarian named Janine, who reminded me of my younger sister, competent, understated, deeply alert. Janine didn't ask why I needed help understanding how a living trust worked. She simply walked me through it, pointing to the sample clauses, showing me which phrases indicated control, which indicated transfer. Her voice was even, neutral, but when she said, "Once this is signed, the original owner's power becomes purely symbolic unless otherwise specified," I felt a tightness in my throat that surprised me. I nodded, as if I'd already known it. Back home, I combed through the photocopies again, rereading the document that had placed my home, my only real possession, the space I had scrubbed, painted, repaired with my own hands, into Marcus's name. It had been signed 3 years ago. I tried to recall the meeting, the paper, the pen, but the memory blurred. I had a vague recollection of being told it was just to keep things simple in case of emergencies, that it would save time and court fees if anything happened to me. At the time, I had thought it made sense, but I hadn't known that it meant I no longer had the right to sell, to mortgage, to even contest changes to the property without his consent. I was, in the eyes of the law, a tenant in my own home. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my chair in the living room, the one that had once belonged to my grandmother, and I listened to the house breathe around me, the creaks of old beams, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional whistle of wind through a poorly sealed window. I thought about all the years I had spent pouring love into this family, the nights I had gone without so they could have more, the endless care, the thousands of unnoticed gestures that made a childhood whole. And yet here I was, a minor character in the story I had written. At some point, I began to write. Not notes, not questions, but my own record, a narrative. I opened a fresh notebook, the kind you find in bulk at the pharmacy, and I began documenting everything. Dates, memories, details. I wanted to create a map, not just for myself, but for anyone who might one day need to understand what had happened. I didn't know if it would ever leave the drawer of my desk, but writing it gave me something no one had offered me in years: agency. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail addressed to me in Marcus's handwriting. Inside was a typed letter. It was written in the tone of someone who thought they were being gentle, but were, in fact, issuing a warning. He thanked me for being understanding about the Bali trip, mentioned that some upcoming changes may be necessary with regard to the house, and casually noted that they were exploring more efficient options for elder care in case I needed additional support soon. He didn't specify what that meant. He didn't have to. I read the letter twice, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it beside the others. I did not call him. I did not reply. But I began to sort through my affairs more urgently. I visited the local notary office and quietly requested copies of every legal form I had signed in the past 10 years. I paid for each page in cash, one bill at a time, like I was buying back my life in fragments. And slowly, a plan began to take shape. Fragile at first, like smoke, but growing clearer with every page I turned. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. Not directly, but the moment was coming. And when it did, it would not be with screams or pleas or accusations. It would be with proof, with quiet strength, with the full weight of my dignity restored. And they would not see it coming. There are certain kinds of silence that speak louder than words ever could. And in the weeks that followed Marcus's letter, I lived inside one of them. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, though I had grown used to that over the years. It was a deeper kind, more deliberate. The quiet of someone who has seen enough to understand that words will only alert the enemy. And so I said nothing. I smiled when they called. I nodded when they visited. I asked no questions and offered no opinions. I let them believe, with every cordial exchange, that I was retreating further into the gentle forgetfulness they had come to expect from me. But beneath that silence, I was busy. The notebook on my desk grew thicker by the day, its pages filled with observations, timelines, financial notations, and, increasingly, a list of names. People I might be able to trust. People whose professions or positions might help me reconstruct the things that had been taken or obscured. At the top of that list was a name I hadn't spoken aloud in more than a decade: Margaret Fields. Margaret and I had worked together at the courthouse back in the 70s, when I was still sharp with numbers and she was beginning her career as a paralegal. We had never been close friends. Our personalities didn't quite match. But there was a mutual respect, an understanding of what it meant to be competent women in a world that didn't make space for us unless we carved it ourselves. She had gone on to become a legal assistant for a firm in the next county over, and though we'd lost touch after Charles fell ill, I remembered her as someone who valued order, justice, and discretion. I found her name online with the help of Aaron, the neighbour's son, who continued to stop by once a week under the guise of helping me set up a family photo archive. I didn't tell him the truth, not all of it, but I think he suspected, in the intuitive way young people sometimes do, that there was more to my requests than nostalgia. When I asked him to look up Margaret Fields and find out if she was still practicing, he didn't ask why. He simply printed the page and left it on my kitchen table with a polite smile. Margaret still worked part-time, it turned out, mostly handling wills and elder law cases. Her number was listed in the directory. I waited 3 days before calling, rehearsing in my mind what I would say. But when her voice came through the receiver, low, firm, unmistakably hers, the words came easily. She remembered me at once. Her tone softened. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and though I never mentioned Marcus's name, she seemed to understand the shape of what I was trying to say. She offered to meet the following week at her office. Just to talk, she said. No pressure. I thanked her, hung up, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to breathe deeply. The morning of our meeting, I dressed carefully. Not out of vanity, but out of something older, something closer to self-respect. I wore a pressed blouse, a soft grey skirt, and the pearl earrings Charles had given me on our 40th anniversary. They didn't match anything else I owned anymore, but they felt right. A talisman of another time, another version of myself. The office was modest, tucked between a florist and an insurance agency, but clean and quiet. Margaret met me at the door, her hair now fully white, her gait a little slower, but her eyes still sharp as ever. We sat across from each other in her office, the blinds drawn, the door closed, and when she asked gently what had brought me there, I did not cry. I did not tremble. I simply opened my folder. Not the whole envelope, not yet, but a carefully curated sampling, and placed it on the desk between us. She read slowly, carefully, her brow furrowing at certain phrases. When she finally looked up, there was no pity in her expression, only concern, and a kind of righteous anger I recognized instantly. She told me, in no uncertain terms, that what had happened was not just unethical, but potentially illegal, that I had recourse, that there were protections for people in my position, that it wasn't too late. I'm not here to sue anyone, I said quietly, folding my hands. I don't want revenge. I just want the truth back in my hands. I want my autonomy. She nodded. That's what we'll aim for. From that point on, things moved carefully but decisively. Margaret helped me begin the process of requesting full legal documentation. Not just copies, but certified records, notarized contracts, property deeds. She contacted the bank's compliance department on my behalf and helped me draft a formal inquiry into the handling of my account. She introduced me to a younger associate in her firm, a woman named Leah, who specialized in elder financial exploitation and would later become one of the most crucial figures in my quiet war. At home, I kept up appearances. Marcus and Talia visited twice during that month, once bringing a casserole I didn't ask for, and the second time dropping off a new blanket for the winter, though it still smelled like the packaging. They never asked how I was feeling. They never noticed the way I had stopped asking about their lives. Their conversations became breezy, mechanical, the kind of visits performed out of habit or duty or guilt. When they left, I made careful notes. Time of visit, duration, tone, remarks. It felt strange at first, cataloguing my own family like a caseworker, but with each entry I felt steadier, stronger. I was building something real, a story backed by fact, a paper trail of my own. Then, one evening, I received a second letter. It was shorter than the first and colder. Marcus explained that, after careful consideration, he and Talia had begun looking into assisted living facilities for me. Places, he wrote, that could better support my changing needs. He framed it as concern, as love. But I could feel the calculation in every word. They were positioning themselves to move me out, to take the house, to seal the last piece of the puzzle while I still breathed in the rooms I had built. I folded the letter slowly, placed it in the envelope with the others, and sat for a long time in the quiet. But I didn't cry. I didn't rage, because by then I was no longer afraid. I had something they didn't know I had: a record, an advocate, a strategy. They thought I was weak because I was old. They thought I was finished because I was quiet. But they had mistaken the stillness of a watchful woman for surrender. And now, they were about to learn the difference. By mid-November, the leaves had begun to fall in earnest, carpeting the backyard in brittle gold and amber, and with each passing day, the trees outside my kitchen window stood a little barer, a little more exposed, much like myself. There was something symbolic in it, I thought, watching the branches give up their cover without resistance, as if nature itself was teaching me how to let things be seen. I was no longer hiding. I was preparing. Margaret had been cautious from the beginning. She reminded me that what we were assembling, this paper trail, this quietly growing case, wouldn't bring comfort in the way revenge stories promised. "What you're doing," she said one morning over tea in her office, "isn't about punishing anyone. It's about reclaiming your place in your own story." And I knew she was right. I wasn't seeking spectacle. I wasn't interested in a courtroom showdown or some dramatic intervention that would end with shouting and shame. I wanted something quieter, something more permanent. I wanted legal clarity, financial independence, and the peace that comes from being seen without having to beg for it. But peace would not come without risk. There was still the matter of the house, my house, and the fact that on paper I no longer held the reins. That document Marcus had me sign, under the comforting fog of just-in-case reasoning, had stripped me of ownership. I had been maneuvered, gently and professionally, into irrelevance. The next logical step would be for them to begin the transition, moving me into a care facility, cleaning out the house, selling it quietly, efficiently, as if I were already gone. I wasn't gone, and I wasn't going anywhere. Margaret connected me with a property attorney, a kind, serious man named Robert Chen, who reviewed the deed transfer and confirmed what she feared. Though the transfer had been technically legal, the surrounding circumstances and my diminished access to documentation raised flags. With the right evidence, he said, we could make a case for undue influence, not easy, but possible. The difficulty, he explained, lay in proving that my consent had been given without full understanding, or that I had been intentionally misled. That's where the timeline, the letters, the absence of records in my name, all of it, would come in. So we kept building. Meanwhile, Marcus grew bolder. Perhaps he sensed something, or perhaps he simply grew tired of waiting. One Saturday morning, without notice, he arrived at my door with Talia in tow. They brought brochures, glossy, pastel-coloured, smiling faces, advertisements for retirement communities that offered community engagement and compassionate care. Talia spoke with the careful cadence of someone rehearsing a script, telling me how important it was to plan ahead, and how many of these places have wait lists, as if I had asked to go anywhere at all. I listened. I nodded. I smiled when appropriate. But my hands stayed folded in my lap, steady and still. When they left, the brochures remained on the kitchen table like strange offerings. I picked one up and placed it neatly in the envelope with the rest. Evidence, not of malice, perhaps, but of erosion. The slow, steady way a person's will can be chipped away by those who say they love her. In the days that followed, I noticed little changes. A second call from Marcus about my prescriptions. A follow-up email asking if I had thought more about housing. It became clear that they were laying the groundwork for a transition. They wanted my cooperation, my quiet exit. What they didn't realize was that I was building my own kind of transition. Not out of this home, but back into control of it. Robert advised patience. Let them move forward, he said. The more they act as though you're no longer in charge, the stronger your claim becomes. And so I waited, not idly, but with precision. I made copies. I recorded dates. I documented tone, posture, wording. I learned to listen between the lines. The way Marcus said, your comfort, but meant our convenience. The way Talia smiled too widely, her eyes already scanning the room for things to discard. Every time they visited, I offered tea. I asked no questions. I let them talk. They thought I was fading, but I was remembering everything. Winter came slowly that year, dragging its feet through December like a reluctant guest, hesitant to enter the room but unwilling to leave. The air grew sharper, the days shorter, and with each dusk that fell too early, I felt the passage of time as a physical presence. Not just on my body, but on the narrative I had been silently building. The house creaked more at night, and though I'd lived with its complaints for decades, that season every groan sounded more personal, more urgent. As though the house itself, sensing the threat of abandonment, was asking me not to give up on it. I didn't intend to. The folders in the bottom drawer of my desk had become a quiet fortress, full of bank records, transaction summaries, medical documentation showing I was in full command of my faculties, and the timeline of every relevant interaction with Marcus and Talia since the financial control shifted into their hands. I'd learned how to write not for emotion, but for fact, how to distinguish between implication and evidence. Robert and Margaret reviewed my records twice more, offering edits, suggestions, careful strategies. The process was slow, painfully so, but each passing day deepened my resolve. The problem was, Marcus was no longer waiting. After the brochures came the visits. After the visits came the decisions. I learned of them not from him directly, but through a voicemail left by a woman named Sandy, a representative from a senior living facility called Pine Hollow Springs. Her voice was cheerful and practiced, informing me that Marcus had scheduled a private tour of the grounds for the following week and that they'd love to show me around. I sat at the kitchen table as the message played, my tea forgotten in front of me, cooling rapidly. I didn't call back. Instead, I called Margaret. I didn't agree to anything, I said, not because I feared legal consequences, but because the weight of it, the audacity, needed to be spoken aloud. She was quiet for a moment before responding. No, you didn't. Which means they've crossed a line. She and Robert accelerated our timeline. It was time to begin drafting a formal legal statement, something that could, if needed, serve as a declaration of contested consent. We would attach documentation proving that I had never requested a transfer of ownership in full knowledge of its consequences, nor consented to being placed in a care facility. We didn't yet file it. That step would come only if Marcus made a legal move. But we prepared it. And with it came a new sense of strength I hadn't felt in years. The strength of a woman who had been erased, quietly but persistently, and was now clawing her way back into her own life with pen, paper, and unwavering clarity. Around that time, a strange tension developed between us, not spoken, but sensed. Marcus's calls became less frequent, his tone more clipped. Talia still tried to play the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law, bringing over store-bought casseroles and commenting on how cozy the house remained despite my age. She made veiled remarks about how I might enjoy the social aspect of a community setting. I smiled and thanked her, but in my notebook, I wrote down her exact words. One Sunday, as snow fell in soft curtains outside the windows, Marcus came alone. I could tell something was different the moment he stepped into the room. Not just his silence, but the way he looked around, like he was seeing it not as his childhood home, but as a property waiting to be transitioned. He didn't sit. He stood by the fireplace and said, in a tone that feigned patience, "Mum, I really think it's time we talk seriously about next steps." I asked him what he meant, though I already knew. He spoke of safety, of inevitability. He said he had spoken to a lawyer, a friend of a friend, who agreed that it was time to make decisions while we still had the chance. He used phrases like decline planning and reducing liability, and for the first time, I saw clearly just how little of me remained in the version of me he now imagined. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a variable, a logistical problem. I nodded when he finished. Then I stood slowly and walked him to the door. "You've made a lot of plans," I said quietly, "but you never once asked me what I want." He blinked, caught off guard. "Of course I have. We've discussed—" "No," I interrupted, not loudly but firmly. "You discussed. I listened." And with that, I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry afterward. Instead, I went to my desk and opened the folder marked Final Copy. It was almost time. It had taken me months to prepare, but when the time came to act, everything moved faster than I expected. Not because I rushed, but because there is a particular kind of energy that awakens when you finally choose yourself. I had spent too many years allowing my voice to soften, my presence to shrink, my decisions to be interpreted through the lens of someone else's convenience. But now, with the legal declaration drafted, my documentation in order, and Margaret and Robert both ready to move if necessary, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission. I was ready to take back what was mine. The day after Marcus's visit, I mailed the first letter, a formal notice prepared by Margaret's office and reviewed 3 times by Robert. It was addressed to Marcus, with a duplicate sent to the family's attorney of record, a name I hadn't known until Margaret helped me request documentation through the local registrar's office. The letter wasn't inflammatory. It wasn't even angry. It was measured, factual, and unflinching. It stated that I had not granted informed consent for the transfer of property, nor had I requested or approved any third-party decision-making regarding my housing or care. It explained that I was under legal advisement and would be challenging the existing documents as potentially coerced or misrepresented. It made clear that, from that moment forward, all matters related to my estate, living conditions, or finances must be handled through legal counsel. I mailed it from the small post office 2 blocks from my house. The woman at the counter asked if I wanted tracking. I said yes. 3 days later, Marcus called. His voice, usually so rehearsed and paternal when speaking to me, now carried an unmistakable sharpness. He didn't open with pleasantries. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight to the point, demanding to know what the letter meant, what I was trying to do, why I was making things so difficult. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. I listened as he cycled through disbelief, then irritation, and then something more complex. Fear, maybe, or at least uncertainty. He kept repeating that he'd only ever tried to help, that he handled things because no one else would, that this wasn't necessary. When he finally paused, I said, with the same tone I used to use when correcting him as a boy, "It became necessary when I stopped being a person in your plans." He was quiet for a moment, and then he hung up. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't even expect understanding. What I needed, and what I now had, was distance. Legal, emotional, psychological. That line was drawn. Talia called later that evening. Her voice was different, cooler, more calculated. She tried to reason with me, told me she understood that aging was difficult, and that sometimes people latched onto bad advice out of fear. She mentioned Margaret by name, subtly implying that I was being manipulated. It was a familiar strategy. Redirect the narrative, plant doubt, make the one resisting seem confused or unstable. I didn't respond to her provocations. I simply told her that all future communication should go through my lawyer. She didn't like that. I could hear it in the breath she took before ending the call. From that day forward, everything became formal. Their visits stopped. The texts stopped. The pleasantries and the casseroles and the cheerful updates about the girls' grades, all of it vanished. And for a few days, I mourned that silence, even though I knew it had been false. There's a strange grief in realizing how much of your connection with someone was rooted in control. But then came something unexpected. A letter from the bank. Official. Marked confidential. It included a full printout of my account records from the past 5 years. Transactions, transfers, access logs. It had taken months of prodding, a legal intermediary, and Robert's relentless follow-up. But finally, the documents arrived. I read them twice, once as a mother, once as a plaintiff. And both times, I felt the same tightness in my chest. There it was, black and white. The record of withdrawals, unexplained payments, luxury expenses tied to overseas travel, tuition, car leases. None of it with my name attached. None of it authorized by me directly. And yet, all of it traced back to accounts in which I was still technically listed as a primary holder. The very funds Charles and I had saved for retirement, for emergencies, for dignity. They had bled it dry. Not all at once, but steadily, methodically. Like siphoning water from a well they thought would never run out. With Robert's help, we flagged the most suspicious entries and began drafting a formal report to the bank's fraud department. Margaret cautioned me again. They'll try to argue family intent, that you knew or agreed or at least benefited. But she also told me that what we had, the statements, the timeline, the letters, could serve as strong indicators of exploitation, particularly when paired with my previous lack of access and the sudden move toward institutionalizing me. I didn't flinch. By January, we had our package ready, a complete dossier. Margaret called it a living archive of a stolen voice. I liked that phrase. It felt true. The final step, Margaret said, would be to initiate proceedings to challenge the deed transfer. A delicate process, but one we were ready for. She advised that we notify Marcus of our intent formally, in writing, giving him the opportunity to reverse it voluntarily before court action began. I agreed. We mailed the letter together. 10 days passed. No reply. Then came a knock on my door, and I knew, before I even opened it, that everything was about to shift again. It was a Thursday, cold and brittle, the sky the colour of old tin, when I heard the knock. Not the uncertain tap of a visitor bringing cookies or the soft rap of a neighbour checking in. This knock was firm, measured, purposeful. I had known, since we mailed the last letter, that something was coming. That silence was only ever temporary with people like Marcus. When you stop playing your role, they come looking for the script, and if you've rewritten it, they demand to see the new draft. I opened the door and found him standing there, alone this time, in a dark wool coat I didn't recognize. There was snow on his shoulders, but he didn't seem cold. His expression was tightly composed, not angry, but calculated, like a man entering a negotiation he assumed he could still win. "Can I come in?" he asked, without waiting for the answer. I stepped aside, not out of courtesy, but because I wanted no misunderstandings. Let him speak. Let him show me exactly who he was. He didn't sit. He walked slowly through the living room, pausing briefly at the mantel where his childhood photos still stood, then turned to face me. His eyes scanned the room the way one might assess a property, not a home. And then he spoke. "I got the letter," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm confused." "You shouldn't be," I replied calmly. It was very clear. "You're accusing me of theft," he said. And though his tone didn't rise, I saw his fingers twitch slightly, the way they used to when he was caught in a lie as a child. "I'm stating what happened," I said, "and preparing to correct it." He laughed once, dry and quiet. "You think a judge is going to overturn a signed deed transfer and 5 years of financial records based on, what, regret?" "No," I said, steady. "Based on misrepresentation and pattern." He shook his head. "Mum, this isn't you. This is Margaret, or that lawyer friend of hers. What's his name? Robert something. They're getting in your head, feeding you this narrative. You're being manipulated." I tilted my head. "The difference, Marcus, is that they explained every document I signed. You didn't." He blinked, just once, and I could see, in that brief fracture, that he realized I wasn't bluffing, not confused, not frail, not drifting. Present, fully present. "You gave me control," he said, quietly now. "You said you wanted help." "I did," I replied. "And you used that help to erase me. You turned stewardship into ownership, care into conquest." He stepped toward me. "This is going to ruin everything." "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. He stood there, mouth slightly open, hands half raised, as if still deciding what mask to put on, the caring son or the wounded victim. But it was too late for roles. I had seen the structure beneath the play. "I can't believe you'd do this to your own family," he said finally, and for the first time, I saw it. Not just entitlement, but disbelief, as if the possibility that I might resist him had never truly occurred. "I didn't do this to my family," I said softly. "My family did this to me." He didn't respond. He walked to the door slowly, as if hoping I might call him back, offer tea, reopen the old script. I didn't. He closed the door behind him with care, but the sound of it rang through the house like a bell. After he left, I sat in the armchair beside the window, watching snow begin to fall again. Thin, quiet flakes like whispers on the glass. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I let them. I didn't try to stop anything I was feeling. I had learned, these last few months, that clarity comes not in moments of certainty, but in the acceptance of conflict. That you cannot be both loved and invisible. That survival, for people like me, women raised to soften, to yield, often looks like defiance. The next morning, Margaret called. Marcus had responded through a lawyer. Predictable. The letter was defensive, full of broad denials and the kind of vague language designed to make legal response difficult. He claimed everything had been done with full transparency and consent, and that any disputes now raised are the result of memory confusion and undue external influence. It was a neat summary of how to gaslight someone on legal letterhead. We filed our own notice in response, formal, thorough, decisive. No threats, no anger, just facts, supported by documents, timelines, signatures, and silence. And then we waited. For several weeks, nothing happened. I kept my routines. I baked bread, tended to the brittle potted ivy in the hallway, wrote in my notebook. I allowed myself small pleasures, fresh sheets, classical music on the radio, sunlight warming the arm of my chair. I was not idle. I was not sad. I was living. Then one morning in March, Margaret called with a kind of quiet urgency in her voice. There had been movement. Marcus's lawyer had proposed mediation. "They're scared," she said. "They want to settle before this becomes public." And in that moment, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had eaten toast alone on my 90th birthday, I understood that I was no longer waiting to be seen. I had made myself visible. Mediation was scheduled for the second week of April, in a private conference room at a neutral legal office downtown. One of those quiet, expensive spaces lined with shelves of books no one reads, where polite hostility is served with coffee in porcelain cups, and everything smells faintly of toner and old paper. I arrived early. Not because I was anxious, but because I had spent most of my life arriving early to things that mattered, and I saw no reason to stop now. Margaret and Robert were already there, reviewing documents, their voices low and measured. They greeted me not as a client, but as a colleague. And I realized then, with a small start, how far I had come. A few months ago, I'd been someone with questions and regrets. Now I was someone with a file, a plan, a story written in my own hand. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by his attorney. A tall, unbothered man with polished shoes and the calm arrogance of someone who believed facts were always negotiable. Marcus looked tired, not unwell, exactly, but thinner, paler. He avoided my eyes as he sat down. I didn't look away. The session began formally. Introductions, terms. The mediator, a grey-haired woman with a voice like a school principal, outlined the rules. No interruptions, no accusations, a shared intention toward resolution. I nodded. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to reclaim. Marcus's lawyer went first. His tone was careful, deferential, but I heard the shape of the argument beneath every phrase, that I was not mentally unfit. No, but perhaps confused. That Marcus had always acted in good faith. That the financial transfers were commensurate with household support obligations and had benefited all parties. That my recent involvement with legal counsel might be the result of external influence or misinterpretation. Margaret remained still. Robert took notes. I waited. Then it was our turn. Robert began with the documents, the transfer forms, the bank records, the absence of written explanation, the lack of independent legal advice provided to me before signing over the deed. He highlighted the sequence of events, the slow removal of my access to statements, the redirection of household finances, the pattern of recharacterizing my property as shared family resources without consent. Then Margaret read a portion of my letter, my words, my voice. She didn't need to shout or accuse. She simply let the text speak. I did not forget. I was not asleep. I was told to sit quietly while my life was handled around me. That is not care. That is erasure. When she finished, the room was silent. Marcus shifted in his seat. His lawyer asked for a recess. The mediator agreed. In the hallway, while Margaret and Robert stepped aside to confer, I found myself standing by the window overlooking the quiet street below. Cars passing, trees blooming late with spring reluctant to settle in. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. It was Marcus. He looked older than he had even the week before. The weariness wasn't physical now. It was deeper. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. When he finally found the words, they surprised me with their softness. "I didn't think you'd fight me," he said. I looked at him, really looked, at the lines forming in his face, the mouth that once opened wide to laugh when I pushed him on swings, the eyes that once brimmed with tears when he scraped his knees. I wanted to reach across decades and find the boy I remembered. But he wasn't there, and I no longer needed him to be. "I know," I said. "That was your first mistake." He blinked, and for the first time I saw not confusion or anger in his face, but something closer to shame. It didn't last, but it was there. The session resumed, but the mood had shifted. Marcus's lawyer proposed terms. The house returned to my name, a settlement covering the disputed funds, and a formal acknowledgement that I would retain independent control over all financial and legal decisions moving forward. There would be no admission of wrongdoing, but the documents would be amended. It was what we had hoped for. Not vengeance, restoration. I signed the new papers 2 days later in Margaret's office. They were crisp, clean, clearly worded. This time I read every line. Margaret offered me a pen, and I signed without trembling. My name, whole, firm, legible. My name, where it belonged. Afterward, she poured us tea. There was no celebration, no toasts, just the quiet satisfaction of work completed, of dignity restored. Later that night, I sat in my living room with the lights low, the documents in a folder beside me, and the windows open to the gentle air of early spring. The house felt different, not newer, not safer, just mine again, fully mine. Not because someone gave it back to me, but because I never stopped claiming it. Marcus hasn't called since. Talia sent a short message. "Hope you're doing well." And nothing more. I don't expect more. I don't need it. I am not a victim. I am a witness. And soon, I would decide what to do with everything I had seen. The papers were signed. The deed was returned. The funds, at least a portion of them, were repaid through a quiet settlement agreement negotiated behind closed doors, with language so carefully crafted it could have come from a legal poetry book. There were no cameras, no gavel, no verdict read aloud. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt something inside me exhale. It was not joy. Joy is for beginnings. This was something else, a settling, a realignment of weight, like standing up straight after years of hunching forward without realizing it, and feeling the tension melt from your spine. I did not tell many people what had happened. Joyce knew bits and pieces. Margaret, of course, knew it all. And sometimes, after our meetings, we would sit together in her office and drink tea in silence. No need to explain the kind of war it had been. Because that's what it was. A war, not of violence or insults, but of memory, of dignity, of ownership. I think often now about how quietly people are erased, how it doesn't always happen in one sweeping act, but in slow gestures, the removal of a document, the redirection of a call, the rewording of a sentence. We'll handle it. Don't worry. We've taken care of that. And little by little, your life becomes something other people live around you rather than with you. They say aging is a process of loss, but no one tells you how much of that loss is orchestrated by those who call it love. After the mediation, Marcus kept his distance. There were no more visits, no more casseroles, no soft-voiced attempts to check in. At first, the silence felt like abandonment. Then it felt like air. One evening, I received a letter from him, not handwritten but typed, folded into a generic envelope with no return address. It was 4 paragraphs of carefully modulated sentiment, apologies for misunderstandings, explanations about stress and miscommunication, and a closing note that he hoped I was finding peace. I read it once, then again. Then I placed it in the bottom drawer, behind the file labelled Final Records, and did not answer. I wasn't angry. I simply didn't need his version of the story anymore. I began to do small things, the kind of tasks I hadn't realized I'd stopped allowing myself. Changing the arrangement of furniture without asking, opening a new checking account in my name only, cancelling a subscription that Marcus had once insisted was essential. I went to the bank in person to request a printed statement, and the young woman behind the counter smiled at me and said, "You know, we don't get many people who ask for paper anymore." I told her that sometimes it's important to hold something real in your hand. In May, I planted basil in the windowsill box again, something I hadn't done in over a decade. I'd stopped after Charles passed, telling myself it was too much work. But the truth was, it had felt silly to grow things when everything else was shrinking. This time, the greens sprouted fast, stubborn, full of scent and purpose. I stood over it in the mornings with my tea and watched it unfurl, and it felt like a kind of small prayer, a thank you to the soil for remembering how to give back. The phone rang less often, and I learned to like the quiet. I no longer reached for it expecting anything. If the girls, my granddaughters, ever asked questions, I never heard of it. I don't imagine Marcus told them the truth. But that wasn't mine to manage anymore. Children grow. They see. One day, perhaps, they will wonder. And if they do, I will be here. Or I will leave behind enough to be understood, in the notebooks I filled with names and dates and facts and thoughts, in the folder labelled "For the Girls," if they ever ask. There is no perfect justice. You don't get back every dollar. You don't get back the birthdays spent alone, or the questions you were too afraid to ask when the damage was still reversible. But you do get back something else. Something harder to define, but more essential. Your reflection, your voice, your outline, no longer faded at the edges. I had begun this year with a quiet breakfast and the slow realization that my family, The very people I had built my life around had left me alone on my 90th birthday, sunning themselves on distant shores with money they took from under my nose. I end the year with that same house, that same chair, but not the same woman, and in a quiet drawer, sealed and notarized, rests a new will, clear, binding, and mine. It doesn't leave everything to Marcus. It doesn't reward silence. It leaves instructions. It leaves truth. And it leaves, above all, the story of a woman who was not erased. She was written back in,